Well, here we are, and we're doing our Monday edition of the WRIT Race. And we just decided that we'd do the video thing. We're going to try and add a little bit of that to the discussion as we roll through the campaign. Of course, it all comes to a crescendo, crashing for some, a bit of an excitement for others. On September the 20th, that would be 3 weeks from today, which is kind of cool when you think of all that happening rather quickly. And of course, John Wright and I have been talking about this since the writs were issued. Let's just remember the writs don't get dropped. The writs were issued back about 2 Sundays ago now when the Prime Minister visited the Governor General. So, it's funny, you and Keith and I did the Friday show, which is typically our provincial show, and we looked at it through the lens of provincial politics. And I think the last thing that we said to Keith to get his perspective on was, do you think the Liberals are going to try to draw Doug Ford out into the light into this campaign because they need something to get going? And no sooner did we publish the podcast than the Prime Minister was out saying, where's Doug Ford? He should be having, his vaccine certificates. So it looks, John, like they're pulling the stops out on that. They want to engage the Premier.
Yeah, and the Premier, we should also say that in that podcast, we were vehemently supporting if the Premier would go out and do that. I mean, we've been calling for that for a while. So the two things came together. I guess if you're going to offer a bunch of money for the provinces to do it, the Premier was easy. He hasn't officially confirmed it. It will come, I guess, today or tomorrow after Cabinet meets. But he basically said, sure. I mean, that's what came from behind the scenes. So again, another issue off the table. We are at a really interesting stage, though. We're past the phony war. We're into the real war now. And we're starting some significant movements for the parties in different parts of the country, and leading up to the debates, which will, be about 10 days from now, in that range. I mean, now's the time when the parties zero in on certain parts of the country. They've got their messages down. They're starting to see in the polls where they're going to have to go after the other parties and what they're going to have to do. And so we're at I would say it's kind of the midpoint for us, where we can step back and say, where are the polls? Where are the parties? Where are they going? So I think this is a really good time to kind of step back and take a bit of a view of where we've got to from there and where we're going from here.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because we typically we just sort of arbitrarily choose the Sunday because that's when we make the turn into the next week, and so we'll do that. And I do want to talk about some of the polling, but before we get there, over the weekend there were the circumstances where the anti-vaxxers were out in force, and to some degree caused security concerns in Bolton to the point where the party decided that it wasn't safe to hold their event. And I thought, okay, well that's going to happen. But it seemed to take on a whole life of its own, and there was some debate, even into Monday morning, as to whether or not the Liberals should be taking more responsibility for where they hold their events and, sort of proximity to the protesters. But as I watched this, I thought, it's one of these things that's out of their control, but it could actually, John, embolden their base to say, to hell with you guys. We're going to get out there and we're going to campaign and follow the Prime Minister's lead. We're not going to back down. And all of a sudden, on a non-issue, he looks like he's a tough guy who's standing up for rights.
Well, he does, but I think also the campaign recognizes that they want to turn whatever is happening in that circumstance into a character issue for the opposition, mainly the Conservatives. So they want to characterize it as not just those people who are part of them. And Aaron O'Toole was very quick to distance himself from it and condemn, the kind of protests that were going on. But we also now have the bozo eruptions where we've got, Cheryl Gallant from the Ottawa Valley, who's always been an issue for the Conservatives. Now, Aaron O'Toole's not going to dump her in the middle of a campaign, but she had a picture of the Prime Minister, where he held his necktie in his neck at one point. They just cut the hand off so you could see him dangling there. And she said some offensive things, and she's done this a number of times, but they profiled that in character with, the protests. And they're now finding some other circumstances within the Tory party groups. The Conservatives are now responding by finding others within the Liberal camp. So we're now into that next phase where we're trying to find party comparisons of character And this is playing into the Liberal hands. I don't know how long or how deep it's going to have an impact, because they're going to want to swing out of that into other areas, particularly heading into the debates. But at this stage in the campaign, the Conservatives have, pretty well handled it well, but the Liberals are taking advantage of it and trying to portray it as a character issue for the opposition party.
Yeah, and I hear that. And even I heard some arguments about, well, if you believe that this was wrong on site, and we shouldn't be kind of putting up with any of that, and if there were any Conservatives involved in it, that's just a bad call. Then why didn't he fire Gallant? And that's going to be one of those things that's just going to hang around his neck until the 20th of September.
Well, I suppose, but I think it also will be like the wind and kind of blow it away after a period of time. I mean, how long can you sustain that? The second thing is, a lot of people will see these protests as being anti-vax and not, associated with the Conservative Party, unless there's, a number of cases can be made that there's a mobilization going on by members of the Conservative Party or by some band in order to do this. But I don't think we held this election campaign to take on the anti-vax movement. And I don't think that's a ballot question. I mean, if you wanted to take those people on and you knew that anger was there, and we know that there are 4 million Canadians who basically disagree with, the vaccination policies and everything else, well, then you didn't have to hold an election in order to do that. So again, they're going to do everything they can to characterize it as being a group of people who are associated with the opposition to the Liberal Party as opposed to just anti-vax. But I don't think it's going to have that much traction. We'll see where it goes over the next few days, but you can't really sustain that over, especially when the Prime Minister is going to Nunavut on his next stop. I mean, you're not, or in Quebec, you tend to have this kind of eruption in Ontario. You're not getting it in other parts of the country. So I don't think that can be sustained too long.
Okay, so let's talk about momentum, and some of that has to do with the polling. And again, the caveat always is, and I'm amazed that we have to keep saying this, but these are not predictive numbers. In fact, what it has done is just shown where the tendencies are and where the minds of Canadians are as voters in terms of what they were thinking when the question was asked at whatever point that question was posed by the pollster. What we are seeing, and I thought was really interesting over the weekend, there was a Nanos number overnight, because Nick does his numbers every day, that saw the Liberals dropping like 2.5 percentage points, which, clearly is a significant drop. Now, you will know better than anybody. Those numbers can kind of bounce around a little bit. So there was, today we saw them kind of perk up a little bit, but still they were behind the Conservatives. But you made this point about 4 days ago. It's not like the Conservatives are charging out to the lead here. They're just kind of floating here, and the Liberals are slowly sinking. And in fact, they're going to soon, be in, if not careful, in NDP territory.
Well, I was at the London Air Show on the weekend, which was spectacular to watch, but in between when the planes were coming or not, I was pretty active on my Twitter account, and I made some statements there that got a lot of attention. And so let me amplify it. And I said, you looked at a couple of the polls that have come out. Main Street and Ecos have polls out, and they have a very different methodology than others. And methodologies matter when it comes to polling. They have what are called IVR, and you could call them robo polls if you wanted to be disrespectful. But if you call them, they select individuals and they send an automated response to them. And oftentimes they're not to people who are just randomly selected out there anymore. They're actually impaneled people where they recruit them and they put them in big panels, and then they send them the information, and then they put all the weighting on them and stuff like that. So, there's two pollsters out there doing that, and one of them is noted for being very accurate. The other one not so accurate in the campaign. So I guess what I said was, when I saw the spread, I said, look, if this is the kind of spread that actually is taking place, then it's going to be very hard for the Liberals to recover from that at this stage in the campaign. If you've got a 5-point spread for the Conservatives over the Liberals, then that's really tough. And they're going to go super negative on the Conservatives if that's the case. But I don't know whether they can recover from that. And I said, mark my words right here, if that's the case, they won't. But I also said, wait till Wednesday. Because there's a few things. When you then get Nanos out and you got Angus Reid out, they show a tighter race, and they go, well, why is that the case? Well, there's a few things. Number one is you've got a different methodology with Angus Reid, which is an online panel, and then and that has a different approach to it. And then you have Nanos, which is a rolling poll. How they do that is that they will do I think Nick does telephone polling, but he's not doing it. I don't think he's doing it randomly. I think he's also doing it impaneled. But they do like 400 a night. So they roll it up. So what you're seeing is a roll up of 400 from last night, 400 from the night before, and 400 from the night before that. And then they give like a point system weighting to each one of those. So the further away, the less prominence that poll of 400 gets. So you would say that last night would get 50% of the weighting, and the night before might get 40% of the weighting, and the one behind that would get 10%. You see what I mean? Like it's weighted because it's closer to it. And so Nick is really kind of rolling things up, and if he's showing a bit of a spread, it might be more or it might be less. So having said all of that, you've got basically 4 different methodologies and approaches on the table by different pollsters. But what they're showing, all of them, is important, and that is the momentum of the Conservatives in each one of them is there. You can see it. Number 2, when those questions are asked about the preference of the party leader and the impressions that they're making and for Prime Minister, there's a shrinkage between Trudeau and Aaron O'Toole. That's coming down. And in terms of momentum of the individuals, the Prime Minister has dropped like a stone, is not getting very much momentum, and Aaron O'Toole is on the ascendancy. So what do we take from all of these polls? Number 1, wait till Wednesday when you've got Ipsos, Leger, Abacus, and then you can look at all of them and you can kind of decide where things are at. Number 2, the polling numbers are tighter than they are apart, but the momentum for the person, meaning Aaron O'Toole, and remember we said you never get a second chance to make a first impression, he's actually moving the numbers ahead. People didn't expect him to do well, but he's sitting now at good numbers. So as an example, when you look at the preference of the individual, you're getting about 52% for Jagmeet. You're getting 38% for Aaron O'Toole, and you're getting 34% for the Prime Minister. And you say, well, the Prime Minister is not far behind. The Prime Minister, in terms of his own personal approval rating, was at 48 back in January. So he's dropped way down. His campaign has negative momentum when you look at all of those polls. So again, I think we're coming into this week before we get ready for the debates. And if you had called this election campaign, the last thing you thought you would be doing right now would be in negative territory behind the other opponent. Number 2 is that they would have all the momentum and you really don't have any. And number 3, that your leader, in fact, would be third on the list instead of first on the list in terms of preference momentum. So I think if you net out where we are after, a couple of weeks of all of this campaigning, Liberals have dropped, no momentum, in trouble. The Conservatives are on the ascendancy in British Columbia, Ontario, and the Maritimes, and they're actually making ground in Quebec. And the NDP a little bit, but it's the Conservatives who are moving ahead in all of those polls, depending upon what you want to look at.
Now, much has been made, early on, certainly by the media, about the opposition parties, specifically the Conservatives, releasing their platform very early in this campaign. And it's not unusual, I don't think, for the opposition to be first as opposed to the government of the day. But everybody now is kind of hounding the Prime Minister and asking, when's the Liberal platform going to come out? Is this even going to move a needle? Is it going to be relevant at all? Well, I can't imagine that it's going to have any impact whatsoever this close to the debate.
Well, it's you see the benefits of having a platform out early. So let's look at Jagmeet and let's look at Aaron O'Toole as one group versus the Prime Minister. They've got solid talking points. And if in fact, again, I don't want to come off sounding like a booster for the Conservatives, but if you listen to Aaron O'Toole at every spot, he sounds fair and reasonable. And he actually has a good understanding of his own policies. Like when you listen to him and he talks about, carbon tax. It's not like he just sort of gives a mealy-mouthed answer or says something that's such a talking point that it talks over the question. He actually is answering it. And he's saying, if you look at this, this is this. And if you look at the other jurisdictions, they do this. And the carbon thing, we're deliberately behind this because we have decided that we're going to have ownership of indigenous nations do this. Like he goes down that whole route and he knows his stuff. And it's, in fact, he's had at times saying, if you look at page 143, okay. So he's very comfortable in his own skin to deal with that. Jagmeet, I mean, he pretty well knows where he is from day one. He's unscripted, and he basically goes, here's what we're going to do on taxes, and this is what we're going to do for the rich, and those sort of things. Prime Minister, not so much. And in fact, I mean, there's not a pillar there, which oftentimes makes it difficult for him to kind of answer except for his standard talking points. But the other thing it's produced is that they're throwing money and policies around like there's no get out. Like it doesn't, you have to tune in every day to the Liberal Party to find what policy they've changed. I mean, it's not like it's here and that's what it is, but every day it's like, well, we're going to throw $1 billion at this and $100 million at that and $600 million at this. Oh, and fresh water. Look at what Stephen Harper did, and look where we are. And that's the other thing. They're comparing everything to the Harper days and in 2015 and not necessarily doing anything. It's kind of like the return to the Harper days. So the Prime Minister, I don't know whether it's going to matter all that much, but I think it goes to a point that those people who were prepared for an election campaign were the opposition parties and not for the major party. You would have thought that they would have had a standard, the little red book. Remember that, Dave? It wasn't Mao Zedong. It was Jean Chrétien. We've seen leaders from the Liberal Party step up and pull the plug and say, this is what this campaign's all about. This is what we're going to do. And they've stuck by it. And that hasn't been the case for the Prime Minister. So I don't know what his policies, actually, I don't know what his policies look like all put together at the end of this campaign. I do not know. Whatever book it's going to be very big, and it's going to have a lot of money attached to it. And I don't know what the score is going to be, but that's why it sort of looks like they're just making it up as they go along. And
to their peril, right? I mean, that has been the issue all along. I mean, if there had been criticism of any government, most of whom across the country at some point was highly praised for their initial response to COVID-19. But if there was a sort of a common cry across the country was, where's the plan? It's clear you're not ready. There's no plan. There's no plan. There's no plan. They've carried that ball into this campaign to the point where, first week, why are we here? And now it looks like, to your point, as if now we're making stuff up as we go along.
Well, but there's another part we haven't really talked about, and that is Brand Trudeau is being battered and is not looking pretty good. I mean, you look at these numbers right here. I mean, I don't want to make direct comparisons to Kathleen Wynne in the Ontario election where they got wiped out, but Brand Wynne was done. Mm-hmm. I mean, and we've seen in political campaigns where they don't talk about the leader, they talk about the team. Because the leader is being tainted. I think if you did a lot of focus groups, what you would find right now, even among people who are liberals, is that they would say Justin's got some issues. I mean, he does have the falseness, to some people, and also his ethics issues and a series of other things. They've kept putting Justin Trudeau in the window, and they've been putting him there as if he is the savior of the party and the leader of the party. And that's what people are voting. He is the ballot question, as opposed to somebody who at that stage has team. I mean, look at Krista Freeland's new, sign. I mean, Freeland, Christopher Canada. I mean, there's not the Trudeau on it. There's not Trudeau mania out there. So, part of this could have been a very different approach. And that would have been the Liberal team. You would have had different spokespeople. You would have had a platform which have talked about that. And we've seen it done in other campaigns. I don't think we've talked enough about how his symbolism of leading the Liberal Party is actually a disadvantage. That maybe underneath all of this are a series of things that people really want, clean water and progressive taxation, series of things like that. And again, you only have to get like 38% of people on board. But for every number that they need, I'm looking at numbers right here. I'll get the next ones this afternoon. Man, oh man, I'm looking at, instead of having 38% for the numbers they need, I'm looking at 30 and 28s. And a lot of it is tied to him. So again, I don't really know whether the platform makes a lot of sense at the moment, if in fact the ballot question appears to be him.
Well, we're going to endeavor to get some insights from Bob Richardson tomorrow on the podcast. And of course, he is a Liberal insider for a long time. It'd be great to put that question to Bob just to see, from outside looking in as a Liberal and, who is no doubt cheering for Mr. Trudeau. I'd be curious to see what his thoughts are on that as we move the ball down the road. All right, that'll do it for this edition of the WRIT Race. We'll be back at it again tomorrow with both the audio version. This you can see on YouTube and Facebook page, and we'll slap it up as an audio file as well. But would encourage you to subscribe wherever you get the podcasts. We'd love it if you would leave us a comment, a rating, etc. So just be great to get your feedback on what we're doing here on the WRIT Race. I'm Dave Trafford. He's John Wright. And this is an Eye Contact podcast.